Hello and welcome to Intro to Data Science Week 5. Before we move on to what we're going to be doing this week, let's go back and have a recap of what we were doing last week. So last week's topics were that we were looking at different data types, different data classes, so looking at R, more of how it's functioning as like a programming language, and then how that relates to when we import our data and how we recode our data in order to mean that we can work effectively with R. We also, at the end, you can see that the worked examples, Mina goes through both the different application exercises. So if you're struggling with the application exercises, we recommend that you try them first, but then have a look at how Mina works on them, so then you can get some of the answers as well. And that hopefully will be helpful for you. So last week we had our first homework. And the deadline for the late homeworks is now passed at this point because the late homeworks is on a Monday at 4 p.m. Now, one thing I want to emphasize is you do need to tell me typically before the deadline if you're going to hand in late. That's the same with extensions. You need to tell the extension team before the deadline has passed if you are going to try hand in your work late. And otherwise, you have to apply for a special circumstance. All of the information about this is on the policies page if you want to have a look at that and get some more information about homework and handing in late and extensions and that sort of thing. I won't go through it here. I'll let you go and read it. We also had our quiz 3. Now, there was some issues with that, and when we get on to this week, you'll see that we pushed the deadline back because over the weekend there was a few issues with the R servers, the RStudio servers, but that's all resolved now, so it should be fine. The readings, I asked you, as well as our normal R for data science, I did ask you to have a look at the final project information. And as we'll see this week, I do want you to read that. So last week it was recommended, but this week it's going to be required that you read the project information because, as I'll get onto, we're going to start working on those this week. We've posted the code alongs, and again, we had an interactive R tutorial, which hopefully you found useful. Now, normally I would go into some of the common questions from the quiz, but as we push the deadline back, I'm not going to do that this week. Instead, we're going to have a look at some of the common questions from the labs and other things that we've been picking up, me and Alex. Alex is going to go through that. And I'm going to save some of the quiz feedback for next week once this delayed quiz hand-in time has finished. So over to Alex.
Okay, so in my section of this video this week, I'd like to talk a little bit about an issue some people were having with the homework. I actually wrote about it on the Blackboard in Lecture Theatre 2 on Friday. But if you weren't in LT2, you might not have seen it. So I just wanted to talk about it a little bit now. And it's an issue to do with ggplot and when you pipe data in and when you can sometimes get an error. When it's a sort of specific combination of mutating and piping and so on that can cause an error. And I'm going to talk about it in the context of a new data set, just to mix it up a bit. I'm going to talk about it in the context of the Palmer Penguins data set. You can get this from the Palmer Penguins package, and once you've called that package and loaded it, the data set itself is just called Penguins. So these are the first 5 variables in the first 6 rows. So we've got species of penguin, the island in Antarctica where the penguins were found, the bill length and depth in millimeters, the length of the flippers in millimeters, the mass of their body in grams, the sex of the penguin, and the year that the observation was taken. And we've got pictures there of the 3 penguins. You can actually see the Gentoo penguins, the one in the middle, at Edinburgh Zoo, if you go there. The other 2 they don't have. So let's have a look at how many penguins we have of each species on each island. And we see there that the Adelie penguins are present on all 3 of the islands. The chinstrap penguins, were only present on Dream Island, and the Gentoo penguins were only present on Biscoe Island. So suppose we wanted to create a new variable for each of these 5 combinations and then do a facet wrap by that. So you might ask, why are we doing that? We could just do a facet grid by the 2 variables. And the reason we're doing that is that if we do a facet grid, we'll find that the 4 sort of empty combinations, the ones where we had no observations, will still appear as little grids. They'll just have no observations on them. And that might be useful in some contexts, but let's suppose that we consider that to be just wasted space. And what we really want to do is just have 5 plots on 2 rows to summarize all the combinations where there are examples. And the way we do that is just by making a new variable to facet by, which represents the combination of species and island. So let's do that. So if we mutate, we can do species island is paste species island, which takes every observation and just smushes them together with the space in between by default. So we've now got a new column called species island. So I've just shown you there the three So if you actually ran this code, what you get is a very large data set being output. We've not assigned it anywhere, so it prints it. But just to demonstrate on this slide, I've shown the three variables that we're going to use in our plot. So build length, build depth, and species island. So now let's make a plot with that. So here's some code that is analogous to the code I saw quite a lot of people using. So we'll pipe it into a ggplot. Our data set is penguins. Our mapping is mapping argument is an aesthetic function. Aesthetics x being the build length and y being the build depth. And then we add some points, and that looks fine. And then let's do the faceting. Let's add that to our sort of pipeline. So we'll add the facet underscore wrap function, and we get an error. So the error is slightly strange, but the error occurs when we use the facet wrap function. So you might think, oh, we must have got that function wrong. And actually, the error was a couple of lines before that, because what we've got going on here is that in that previous line, in the ggplot line, by putting the data equals penguins, what we've done is we've piped in our penguins data set, but then we've said, actually, no, our data set is penguins. So we've given it two data arguments, essentially. We've given it one at the beginning of the function, which is the one that's piped in. Another one we've expressed by name, data equals penguins. And the ggplot function takes the second of those. So it takes data equals penguins. And what's the problem with that? Well, that goes right back to the original penguins data set. And we haven't done the mutate on that yet. We've never stored the mutate anywhere. We've just created a new variable in this pipeline, which means that that data set doesn't have the species underscore island variable, which is fine. It doesn't cause an error at that point, but it causes an error once we try and use that variable because it just says, well, that variable doesn't exist. So the way to fix that is that the data equals penguins argument is completely redundant. We don't need it because we're piping in. So we could just write mapping equals AES, etc. And everything works, and it's just as we expected. We want to clean this up a bit, put some better axis labels on, maybe clean up the names of the facets, because that's not very clear what that means. But yeah, that's basically what we want, modulo some cleanup. Okay, so how can we avoid this argument, or this issue? One way to avoid this is by just being careful when we're using the ggplot function, that if we are piping something in, we don't need to put a data argument. But I think there's a way of helping you get into the habit, because the thing that was confusing here was that the error didn't occur until way down. And that's because the tidyverse is trying to be friendly. It's trying to interpret what you put in as something sensible. And eventually, unfortunately, that means it's guessed what you meant, but it's guessed wrong. And so we get an error later on. So it'd be nice if our code had initially thrown up an error as soon as we tried to run the ggplot. So the way to avoid that, I'll just talk through again. So let's start again. Let's take our mutate statement. That's doing exactly as it did before. But let's try not putting the argument names inside ggplot. So instead of putting data equals something and mapping equals something else, we'll just put those two things in, the data first, then the mapping. So general practice with the tidyverse is it's a good idea to specify your arguments to functions by name. The exception is for really common ones. And on ggplot, you always start with the data, and the second thing is always the mutate. And when we do that, we get an error straight away as soon as we try and make a plot. And that's because what's happening now is the data set is being piped in as the first argument, just as before. But because we haven't said mapping equals penguins, we've just said penguins. Now it says, hang on, the first argument was penguins. You've now given me a second argument. You haven't said what it's called. So that must be the mapping argument. But the mapping argument is a data set. So that's wrong. That doesn't make sense. So we already get the error at this point. And that means that we can debug at this point and say, okay, yeah, we've put the penguins in the data. We didn't need to. And then that works. And when we add the facet wrap just from there, that works again. So my tip for avoiding this error and avoiding accidentally sort of replacing your data set in a ggplot is to get into the habit of, when you're starting a function, not putting the data equals something and mapping equals something else on arguments at the beginning and just to write the two things. It will also make your code look a little bit cleaner because it's shorter. People will still understand what you're trying to do because those two things are so common. And it has the added bonus that if you try and pipe in data and explicitly define data at the same time, it will give an error.
Thank you, Alex. Let's have a look at what's coming ahead this week. So the first thing is that we want you to watch the videos, do the readings, complete the assignments, but also provide us course feedback. Now, we asked for this in week 3. We didn't get a lot of feedback, but you'll see that on all your other courses, at least in the School of Maths, now is the time that we also ask for more feedback on the course. This is useful for us to know what's going well, what's not going well. If we get a low response rate like we did last time, it's hard for us to know if there's any areas that we need to think about addressing. Now, obviously, there's some areas that we can't address this year, but hopefully we can adjust things so that they work a little bit better from your perspective. So please fill that out. In fact, the deadline for that is next week, the end of next week. So you've got plenty of time to fill that in. The videos this week are about effective data visualization, how we can design studies and use data to do data science effectively, but also communicate our results and our code as best as we can. So we're kind of combining not only how can we do data science and then communicate what we're doing to others, we're including other people who are interested in our results and also other people who are interested in our code. And so that's why when we move down to the readings, we've got the Tidyverse style guide here as well as an optional reading. But we do recommend having a look at that because it's the style guide we'll be recommending for you to use on the course, and it will help, tidy your code up so it's presentable when we're marking your work. Now, just going back to the assignments, I think I said this earlier in the video, but we did push back the quiz until Tuesday, the end of Tuesday. But your other quiz is on Sunday as usual. You'll also notice in the place of the Lab 4 that we've got Project Proposal at the same time. So on Tuesdays, you normally hand in your labs, but this week we've asked for your project proposal. And that is because in the lab this week, we're going to be working on our project proposals. So what we want you to do is we want you to talk to your team throughout the week and get an idea of what data you want to work on, what sort of things that you're interested in, maybe even having a look at the data and comparing it with others, but then use that lab time to work on it together, all in the same room, and then call over your tutor and maybe give them a little brief example of what you're trying to look at, and then hopefully they can provide some feedback then, which will help when you're developing your proposals. Your proposals need to be handed in, as I say, as you would normally hand in your labs, and it's the same process. You have a repository and you need to push that, and then it will close at the deadline so we can start to review them and give you feedback on what we think about your proposal. I've also created the Homework 2 repositories now, so please let me know if you don't have that. Again, that's in for next week because the homeworks are every other week. If you're ever wondering, or if you're wanting an overview of the deadlines on this course, please check the Assessments tab, and then there's the deadlines there. So the readings this week are a combination of the website. I do want you to have a read over the final project information because that'll mean that you're prepared when you turn up to the lab this week to work on your final project proposal. And then we've got R for Data Science, which should be a familiar textbook to you now because we've been using it a lot on the course. Introduction to Modern Statistics is also, we've got 2 chapters from that this week. And we also have the Tidyverse style guide, as I mentioned before. We also have another interactive tutorial, which we recommend doing because the Lego data used in that interactive tutorial is going to be useful for your homework too when you get around to doing it. I hope you have a great week. I'm looking forward to seeing you in all the different interactive sessions we have on this course. And so I'll see you soon.